Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling something pretty big, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
We're looking at Justice Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion in the Dobbs case.
Right.
You know, the one that overturned Roe v. Wade.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of folks are focused on the Dobbs decision itself, but Justice Thomas's concurrence, it kind of adds a whole other layer to things.
Yeah.
And it opens up a debate about a whole bunch of other Supreme Court precedents and whether they might be vulnerable too, which is what we're going to get into.
Definitely.
So we'll be doing a deep dive into this thing called substantive due process. It's a legal concept that's been used to justify a bunch of landmark decisions.
Oh, yeah. Some big ones.
Like Griswold, the case about contraceptives, Lawrence, which dealt with same-sex intimacy, and even Obergefell, the one that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide.
And Justice Thomas's view on this whole doctrine of substantive due process, it's causing quite a stir, you know?
Yeah, why is that?
Well, he believes it doesn't really have a solid basis in the Constitution.
Interesting, because even though he agrees with the outcome in Dobbs, his reasoning in this concurrence seems like it could be applied much more broadly.
That's exactly right.
Yep.
To really get why this is so significant, we kind of have to go back to Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization itself.
The case that overturned Roe.
Right, which essentially said there's no constitutional right to abortion.
Okay.
But Justice Thomas, he goes a step further. He argues that the 14th Amendment's due process clause, it should only be about making sure legal procedures are fair, not about guaranteeing specific rights like the right to privacy, which was central to Roe.
So he's making a distinction between the process of law and the substance of the law.
Exactly. He's saying substantive due process, where the court finds rights implied within that clause, it goes too far. He actually even calls it an oxymoron.
An oxymoron?
Wow.
That's pretty strong language coming from a Supreme Court justice.
It is. It shows you how fundamentally opposed he is to this concept of substantive due process. So for Justice Thomas, the word due in due process, it's all about the procedures the government has to follow. Basically, are you being treated fairly by the legal system?
Okay.
But he thinks this idea of substantive due process, it lets judges invent rights that aren't actually clearly written in the Constitution.
Yeah.
And he sees that as going way beyond what the due process clause was supposed to do.
So is he saying that when the court relies on substantive due process to establish these implied rights, it's like they're overstepping their boundaries, making policy decisions that should be left to legislatures?
That's right. He argues that this kind of judicial policymaking, it undermines democracy because it takes power away from the people we elect to make those decisions and puts it in the hands of judges who aren't elected.
I see.
And to really illustrate this point, he uses a pretty striking example from history, the Dred Scott case.
Oh, wow. That's the case before the Civil War that upheld slavery, right?
Yeah, and it's a powerful way for Justice Thomas to make his point. So in Dred Scott, the Supreme Court, they used substantive due process to protect what they considered a fundamental right to property.
Right.
But in this case, tragically, that property included enslaved people.
Wow.
And Justice Thomas cites this case to show how substantive due process can be warped and used to justify really terrible outcomes.
That's a sobering thought.
Right.
It's like he's drawing a direct line from decisions like Dred Scott to modern cases like Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell.
He is.
Suggesting that if his view of substantive due process gains traction, those cases could be in jeopardy too.
And he's very clear about that. He explicitly calls for the court to reconsider all opus precedents that are based on substantive due process.
Really? All of them?
Including those landmark cases you just mentioned. He straight up says that decisions protecting access to contraception, same-sex intimacy, and marriage equality, that they're demonstrably erroneous and need to be corrected.
Wow. This is clearly a much bigger conversation than just overturning Roe. It's like he's making a fundamental critique of how the Supreme Court's been interpreting the Constitution for decades.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, if not substantive due process, then what does Justice Thomas propose as an alternative?
Well, he does offer an alternative, and this is where things get even more interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
Instead of substantive due process, he suggests looking at the privileges or immunities clause of the 14th Amendment as a possible way to protect certain rights. But as you can imagine, this opens up a whole other can of worms.
Okay, so let's unpack that.
Yeah.
What is the privileges or immunities clause exactly, and why hasn't it been used much historically?
Well, it basically says that states can't make or enforce any laws that would take away the privileges or immunities of U.S. citizens. It was intended to protect fundamental rights from state interference, but for some complicated historical reasons, the Supreme Court's pretty much ignored it for over a century.
So Justice Thomas is suggesting dusting off this rarely used part of the Constitution to potentially replace a legal doctrine that's been central to American law for generations. That's a bold move.
It is, and that's why this whole debate is so important. His challenge to substantive due process and his call to return to the Privileges or Immunities Clause, it could completely change the legal landscape.
It sounds like we have a lot to unpack here.
We do.
Shall we dive deeper into Justice Thomas's critique of substantive due process and what he sees as its flaws?
Absolutely. I think understanding his reasoning is key to grasping just how big this debate really is.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper into Justice Thomas's critique of substantive due process.
Okay.
You know, he doesn't just see this legal doctrine as flawed. He sees it as dangerous. And his concerns go way beyond just the issue of abortion.
He does call it dangerous. What exactly makes him so wary of substantive due process?
Well, he has three main concerns.
Okay.
The first one, as we've kind of touched on already, is judicial overreach.
Okay.
He really believes that substantive due process, it gives judges too much power to basically invent rights that aren't actually spelled out in the Constitution.
Right.
And he argues that this undermines democracy.
So he's saying those decisions should be made by lawmakers, the people we elect, not by judges.
Exactly. He thinks interpreting the Constitution should be about sticking to the text, the original intent of the people who wrote it.
Right.
Not about reading in new rights that they didn't explicitly put in there.
Right.
He sees substantive due process as a way for judges to impose their own personal values on the law instead of actually interpreting the will of the people as expressed through their elected representatives.
That makes sense. But isn't there also an argument to be made that the Constitution is a living document, that it should be interpreted in light of how society has changed?
There is. And that's the heart of the debate between originalism, which is what Justice Thomas believes in, and a more evolving interpretation of the Constitution. It's a debate that's been going on forever, and Justice Thomas's stance on substantive due process, it's bringing it front and center again.
Okay, so judicial overreach is concern number one. What's his second concern about substantive due process?
His second concern is that it creates inconsistencies, distortions, in how the court actually applies the law.
How so?
Well, the court uses these different levels of scrutiny when they're deciding if a law is constitutional or not.
Right.
When a law infringes upon what the court considers a fundamental right, they apply something called strict scrutiny, meaning the government has to have a really compelling reason for that law to exist. But if the right isn't considered fundamental, then the bar is much lower.
Okay.
And Justice Thomas is saying substantive due process creates this uneven playing field.
I see.
Where certain rights get special treatment and others don't.
So because substantive due process allows for these implied fundamental rights that aren't specifically written in the Constitution, it creates this system where judges are essentially picking and choosing which rights they think deserve more protection.
Exactly. And he argues that this distorts the law, creates a hierarchy of rights that's based on what judges prefer, not on a consistent interpretation of the Constitution.
Okay, I'm following you. So we've got judicial overreach and distortion of the law. What's the third concern?
Well, his third concern really gets to the heart of why this whole debate is so important. Justice Thomas believes that substantive due process can have truly dangerous consequences. He's not just talking about legal theory here. He's talking about real-world harm. And the example he uses to illustrate this point, well, it's pretty chilling. The Dred Scott case.
Yeah, that's considered one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever. Can you remind us what happened in Dred Scott and how it connects back to substantive due process?
So in Dred Scott, the court was trying to decide whether enslaved people could be considered citizens with constitutional rights. And they used substantive due process to protect what they saw as a fundamental right to property.
Okay.
Which tragically in this case included enslaved people. They basically ruled that Congress couldn't ban slavery in U.S. territories because doing so would violate slaveholders' Fifth Amendment rights to property.
So Justice Thomas is saying substantive due process, even though it's supposed to protect rights, can actually be twisted, used to justify awful things.
Exactly. He's using Dred Scott as a stark warning to show how this doctrine can be misused with devastating results. For him, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of judges going beyond what the Constitution actually says,
Right.
creating rights based on their own personal views instead of the text of the Constitution.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful argument against substantive due process.
Right.
But if we were to completely abandon this doctrine, what would happen to those landmark cases that have been decided based on it, like Griswold, Lawrence Obergefell?
Right.
Those cases have had a huge impact on people's lives. They guarantee rights that many people consider fundamental.
That's the big question, isn't it? If substantive due process goes away, what happens to all those rights that have been established based on it?
Yeah.
It's definitely something that has a lot of people worried, and for good reason.
Justice Thomas does suggest maybe looking at the privileges or immunities clause as a possible alternative. But we haven't really gotten into what that would look like in practice.
Right. And it's important to point out that even Justice Thomas recognizes how complicated this would be. You know, shifting from substantive due process to the privileges or immunities clause, it's not a simple swap.
Yeah.
It would mean revisiting a part of the Constitution that's been basically dormant for over 100 years.
Wow.
And figuring out how to apply it in the modern world.
That sounds like a huge undertaking.
It would be.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why his concurrence in Dobbs has caused such a stir. He's not just voicing a different opinion, he's laying out a vision for a totally different way of interpreting the Constitution.
That's like he's throwing down a gauntlet, challenging everyone to rethink how we approach these things.
Yeah, and whether other justices will be willing to go along with him, that's something we'll have to see. But one thing's for sure, his critique of substantive due process has sparked a debate that could reshape the legal landscape in major ways.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
I feel like we've just scratched the surface of this issue.
We have. But at least we've laid some groundwork for understanding the core of Justice Thomas's argument and why it's causing so much concern.
So where do we go from here? Should we explore what could happen if Justice Thomas's view takes hold and what it could mean for these landmark cases?
Definitely. I think understanding the potential consequences is crucial to grasping the full weight of this whole debate.
All right, let's do that. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time unpacking Justice Thomas's critique of substantive due process.
We have.
And it's obvious this isn't just some abstract legal argument happening in a courtroom. It has real consequences for real people.
Absolutely. You know, if we were to abandon substantive due process, the ripple effects could be huge.
Like what kind of ripple effects?
Well, we're talking about potentially rolling back established rights related to things like contraception, same-sex relationships, marriage equality.
Right.
These precedents, they're not just words on paper. They affect how people live their lives, love, build families.
If those rights were to be reconsidered or even overturned, it's hard to imagine how big of an impact that would have.
Yeah, it's really hard to overstate. And I think what makes this debate so fascinating is that it goes beyond specific legal points. It touches on these really fundamental questions about what our Constitution means and how we should interpret it.
Okay, so let's talk about those questions. Are other justices going to join Justice Thomas in saying we need to reevaluate substantive due process? Is there a chance this could become the dominant view on the court?
It's tough to say for sure what will happen. Right now, Justice Thomas is the only one explicitly calling for this kind of major shift.
Okay.
But you can't deny that the makeup of the court has changed recently, and his perspective, this originalist viewpoint, it's gaining ground. So whether a majority of the court will eventually agree with him on substantive due process, well, only time will tell.
It seems like we're at a real turning point in terms of how we interpret the Constitution.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you've got Justice Thomas arguing for this very strict tank-based approach. And then on the other hand, you have this idea that the Constitution is a living document that should be interpreted in light of how society has changed and modern values.
You've put your finger on it. This back and forth between originalism and a more evolving view of the Constitution, it's been brewing for ages. And what Justice Thomas is doing with substantive due process, it's forcing everyone to confront it head on.
It does feel like he's drawing a line in the sand, making us really grapple with these fundamental questions about the role of the judiciary, what the Constitution means, the nature of rights in a democracy.
It's a defining moment for sure, and I think it really highlights how important it is for all of us to be having these conversations about these complex legal issues. We can't just sit back and watch this unfold. We need to understand the arguments, the potential consequences, what this all means for the future.
I think this deep dive has definitely been a step in that direction.
Yeah.
We've explored the history of substantive due process, looked closely at Justice Thomas's critique, considered the potential outcomes.
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
Hopefully our listeners walking away with a better grasp of this whole issue.
I hope so. It's complicated but important.
So any final thoughts for our listeners as we wrap up this deep dive?
I would just encourage everyone to really think about what they've learned and what this debate could mean for their own lives and for the country as a whole. How do you feel about balancing originalism with a more evolving interpretation of the Constitution? What do you think about the possibility of abandoning substantive due process altogether? These aren't easy questions, but they're questions worth asking.
Yeah, they are. Engaging with these questions is crucial to being an informed citizen, especially now when the very foundation of our rights is up for debate.
Absolutely. And remember, the future of our legal landscape, it's not set in stone. It's shaped by the conversations we have and the actions we take. So stay informed, stay engaged, and make your voice heard.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And as always, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.